Hello, welcome to the Echoes of Shadows channel. Even places that seem the happiest can be full of dangers and horrors. Ghosts lurk in every corner, and creepy shadows watch us from afar. Today, you will hear 3 true stories about McDonald's. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more dark and chilling stories. Thank you. Story 1. The Shadows of the Restroom.
I worked at a McDonald's in a small town for almost 2 years. It was a modest job, but there was one task that always caused me great discomfort: organizing the freezer. Most people wouldn't understand why I was afraid. After all, a freezer is just a cold place full of food boxes. However, for me, the freezer at that restaurant had a peculiarly eerie feeling, something beyond the simple discomfort of the cold. The environment inside the freezer was always oppressive. The internal lights were dim and couldn't penetrate the ice that had accumulated on the walls and ceiling. The cold penetrated to the bones, and the constant hum of the motor was like an uninterrupted background buzz. Although I knew it was just the normal conditions of a freezer, there was something in the atmosphere that made me feel as though I was being watched, a persistent sense that there was something more there with you. One night, while working the graveyard shift, I was assigned to reorganize the freezer, a task I had always avoided if I was honest. It was a particularly cold and quiet night, and I knew this meant the task would be even more unpleasant. I grabbed my flashlight, a tool I normally wouldn't need but which gave me a false sense of security, and entered the freezer. The first minutes were the hardest. The internal temperature was lower than usual, and I quickly started to feel the biting cold penetrating my clothes. As I began to move the boxes and reorganize the products, a strange sound began to emerge from the constant hum of the freezer. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound I couldn't immediately identify. I thought it might be the motor, but there was something different about that sound, something that resonated with the primal instinct of fear that was beginning to awaken in me. My heart started to race, and even though my rational mind tried to convince me it was just the freezer motor, the feeling that something was wrong was almost palpable. I decided to follow the sound, believing it could be some sort of interference with the motor's operation. However, the further I went towards the sound, the more intense the feeling of dread became. Finally, I reached a darker corner of the freezer, where the beam of the flashlight barely illuminated the frozen walls. The sound was louder now, and the growling seemed closer. It was such a deep and primal sound that it felt like there was a physical presence, almost as if the very air around me was charged with strange energy. With my hand trembling, I shone the flashlight into the corner, and that's when I saw it. Among the stacked boxes, there was a small creature, crouched and watching me with intensely glowing eyes. Its eyes were a deep red, almost like they were reflecting fire. The creature's skin was pale and wrinkled, with a texture that resembled snake skin, but even more deformed. Its body was thin and largely hairless, and the way it was positioned, crouched among the boxes, was oddly both human and animal at the same time. It was as if something that shouldn't exist had hidden in that corner, waiting. The creature stared at me with a penetrating gaze, and upon noticing my presence, it emitted a sharp and irritated growl. The sound was so disturbing it made me freeze in place. The creature seemed as hungry as it was terrifying, and its movements were slow and calculated, as if it was preparing for an attack. At that moment, I realized the feeling of fear wasn't just my imagination. It was real, and there was something truly threatening there with me. I managed to regain control of my legs, which had been paralyzed by fear, and ran out of the freezer. I stumbled over the boxes. The biting cold felt like physical pain, and the noise of my panic echoed through the frozen environment. I slammed the door shut, gasping, as my heart pounded so fast it felt like it was about to explode. Without wasting any time, I ran to where my co-workers were and told them what had happened. They laughed and said I was imagining things. One of them even suggested I had been in the freezer too long and started hallucinating. Despite their words, I knew what I had seen. The next day, when the managers arrived and heard my story, they conducted a thorough inspection of the freezer, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The freezer was exactly as it should be, and the creature I had seen seemed to have disappeared. Still, the experience left a deep mark on me. I refused to go into that freezer alone again and requested a shift change, or at least not to have to reorganize the freezer. The memory of that night haunts me to this day, and I wonder what that creature was and where it came from. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps something far more sinister lurks in the frozen depths of that freezer. Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on my mind and made me question what we really know about the world around us.
Story 2. The Night Shift.
In 2015, I worked at the McDonald's in my town for about 4 months. Yes, it didn't last long. I like to think there's something better out there for me than fast food. Besides, that experience definitely didn't make me want to stay. It is, without a doubt, the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. Trying to impress and move up quickly, I let the managers know that I would cover any shift they needed and could take any last-minute calls. I needed the money. The more hours, the better. Well, one night around 8 p.m., just before my shift ended, I got a call from work. Someone from the night shift had called out, and, very annoyed and tired, I reluctantly agreed to cover the shift and got ready. I had never worked nights before, neither at this McDonald's nor at any of my previous jobs. I was kind of excited. I mean, it was night. There would be at least half the number of customers, and the shift manager was Joe, the chillest guy working there. Easy money. When I arrived around 8:30, the place was packed. I clocked in and started handling the mountain of customers in the lobby. By about 10:30, the sudden rush had subsided, and the building was practically empty. The previous shift leader had left me with a simple, "Good luck," even though it was my first night shift. So it was just Joe and me. He was busy checking drawers or something while I handled the drive-thru, the counter, and the grill. Needless to say, I was nervous. If too many people came in, I would be in trouble. Anyway, at our restaurant, and I don't know if it's the same at all McDonald's locations, our headsets emit a signal whenever someone enters the drive-thru, a sound that gets really annoying really fast. And that's exactly what I heard suddenly. Naturally, I greeted the customer. "Hi, welcome to McDonald's. How can I help you today?" I said with so much fake enthusiasm that it even made me sick. I never quite understood if it was a sensor or a scale that indicated if a car was passing by, but the microphone was ready to pick up the customer's voice while they placed their order. However, all I heard was white noise. No response, not even the hum of a parked engine. It was as if no one was there. Now, this wasn't too strange. It had happened a few times since I started working there. The device can be triggered by someone passing around the building or a person walking nearby. The device definitely needed fixing. I didn't want to know every time someone took out the trash, rolling the bins across the drive-thru. After about 3 minutes of static, the microphone shut off, indicating whatever it was had left. Finally, no annoying sound in my ear, but less than a minute later, it turned on again, that signal blaring in my ear. I rolled my eyes and repeated my greeting. "Hi, welcome to McDonald's. How can I help?" And again, there was no response. The microphone stayed on longer this time, but I swear for a moment I heard heavy breathing. I started to get scared. At that moment, I was sure someone was out there trying to scare me. It shut off after about 10 minutes of me hearing nothing. I was tempted to take off the headset and have Joe use it, but my do-your-best attitude prevailed. I tried to distract myself, started wiping down counters that had already been cleaned, and checked if anything in the lobby needed restocking, but everything was in order. I needed to keep myself occupied, There was something so sinister in the darkness of the night just beyond the large windows of the lobby. When the signal went off again, I nearly had a heart attack. I probably should have turned down the volume on that headset. Before I could say my usual greeting, I heard the loudest, most terrifying scream. The moment I heard that scream, I pulled off the headset and stepped back. What the hell was that? Trembling, I put the headset back on. I was scared and angry at the same time. Without thinking, I ran outside to the drive-thru. I stood right next to the menu board and there was no one there. But still, somehow, the static from my headset never went away. The microphone was still active. Whatever had triggered the drive-thru was still there. And then I heard it. "I see you," a whispering voice slowly coming from the microphone. I ran back inside as fast as I could. I was standing right next to the microphone, and there was no one there. No one could have made that sound. There was no one who could have said those words to me. I ran back to the light and warmth of the building and to the safety behind the counter. I found Joe, who was at the manager's desk, his head in his hands as he typed dates into the future schedule. "What the hell was that?" I said louder than I meant to. He jumped in his chair and turned around. "Man, you scared me." "What are you trying to do?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" "I didn't do anything," he replied, returning to typing on his computer. I kind of felt bad. I had just interrogated my superior, the only fun superior who worked there. Crap. I walked to the front and stood behind the counter, just waiting. It was about 1:30 when I looked at the clock again. We were halfway through the graveyard shift. The night was dragging by. I ended up in the corner of the drive-thru so I could play on my phone away from the nearest camera's view. We had only 2 customers in the last hour, so it was even slower than I had thought it would be. So I just stood there, leaning on the counter next to the computer, playing Candy Crush and checking Facebook from time to time. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze on my arm, sending shivers down my spine. I looked toward the drive-thru window, and it was slightly open. I didn't care, didn't pay attention, and kept randomly browsing online profiles. Then a sound. I dropped my phone, shattering the screen when it hit the ground. I almost had a heart attack. My eyes scanned everything, searching for the source of the sound. The drive-thru window had been opened forcefully, but I was right next to it. I didn't hear anyone running or approaching, and I definitely didn't see anyone. So who the hell just opened the drive-thru window? I was done. I took off the headset and stayed in the kitchen, pretending to work, waiting for that awful shift to end. If anyone went through the drive-thru, I wouldn't care anymore. I wouldn't come back after that night. The rest of the night, or morning I guess, passed without further incidents. Never in my life have I encountered something as strange and terrifying as being out there, next to the microphone on that cold night, and then hearing those whispered words to me. I'll never forget it, and I'll do whatever I can to avoid working fast food. And I'm no longer a fan of horror movies. I know I'm in denial, but I pray every day that what I heard that night was just a prank, not a ghost or a demon trying to mess with me. But if it really was, I fear there's nothing to stop it from happening again.
Story 3. The Shadows of the Restroom.
It was an ordinary night at the McDonald's in the small town where I worked. The traffic was slowing down after 10 p.m., and the restaurant was almost empty. I was responsible for cleaning the common areas, a task that usually was a calm part of my nighttime routine. The restaurant was in a state of relaxing calm, which was always a relief after a busy day. The only other people with me on the shift were a cashier and a cook, and we were all more focused on closing up than on anything else. After cleaning the tables and sweeping the floor, I decided it was time to tackle the less pleasant task, cleaning the restrooms. I always left this part until the end of the shift, mainly because it wasn't the most enjoyable job. The McDonald's restrooms had an atmosphere that, even when clean, always felt oppressively uncomfortable. The lights were dim, and the mix of odors and dampness created an environment that made anyone feel an almost tangible discomfort. That night, I entered the men's restroom, and to my surprise, one of the stall doors was closed. I figured there might be a customer still inside and decided to return later. As I walked through the other areas, I began to notice an unusual silence. The restaurant was so quiet that the sound of my own footsteps seemed amplified. The silence was only broken by the occasional flicker of a light bulb and the low hum of the fans. When I returned to the men's restroom, the stall door was still closed. I knocked on the door, asking if anyone was inside, but received no response. The lack of response and the almost deafening silence were starting to disturb me. The restroom seemed darker than usual, with shadows projecting oddly on the walls due to the poor lighting. The odor, which was usually somewhat unpleasant, was now stronger and heavier, almost as if something was hiding in the depths of the environment. I pushed open the stall door, which creaked open slowly, the sound seeming amplified by the silence around me. The interior was empty, and the feeling of discomfort increased. The space seemed even darker and more oppressive, and the moisture marks on the walls were more visible than usual. The sense that something was wrong grew stronger by the moment. While I was in the stall, I realized something was different. There was a persistent feeling that I was being watched. The cold in the air seemed to have increased, and the musty smell was more pronounced. I looked up, trying to identify any issues, and that's when I saw him. There was a man crouched on top of the stall divider. The sight was as absurd as it was terrifying. He was partially hidden in the shadows, and his eyes shone with an almost supernatural intensity. The glow of his eyes was so intense, it seemed to reflect an inner light, illuminating the darkness around him. His smile was distorted and grotesque, with yellowed and uneven teeth that looked worn down by time. The image of the man, with his penetrating gaze and bizarre smile, was so out of place, it seemed like a nightmare come to life. The sight of the man made me recoil instantly. My heart was pounding so fast, I could barely breathe. Fear overtook me, and my mind was in a state of absolute panic. Recoiling from the stall, I stumbled over paper towel boxes in the damp floor, which only increased the sense of disorientation. The fan noise had stopped, and the silence was oppressive. I ran out of the restroom, trying to stay calm, but feeling an increasing urgency to alert my colleagues. They were in the service area, and upon telling them what had happened, the panic was evident on their faces. We decided it was best to end the shift early and investigate what was causing the restroom's strange behavior. However, upon reviewing the area, everything seemed normal. The restroom was as it always was, and the man's presence seemed to have vanished without a trace. Fear and anxiety stayed with me for the rest of the shift. Even with the staff trying to reassure me that nothing was abnormal, the feeling of terror didn't diminish. The idea that something so disturbing could be hidden in such a mundane place as the restaurant's restroom seemed almost surreal. By the end of the shift, as we closed the restaurant and I prepared to leave, the dread was still present. The environment seemed to have a sinister aura, and every small sound seemed amplified by the night's stillness. The memory of the man in the restroom, with his grotesque smile and disturbing gaze, haunted me constantly. I decided it would be best to avoid the restroom during the next shift and, if possible, switch shifts to avoid facing any other frightening experiences. The experience was so impactful that, eventually, I decided to leave the job at McDonald's. The feeling of being constantly watched and the memory of that man in the shadows were enough to deeply unsettle me. To this day, the thought of what happened that night haunts me, and I wonder if there was more to it than just a hallucination or a trick of the mind. The presence of the man in the restroom left an indelible mark on my memory, and the feeling of terror I experienced remains a vivid and unsettling reminder.